it's rare that I have moments like this in my process. It's actually very nice that it's all been filmed and it continues to be filmed. About 4 years ago now, when I licensed Peter Lawrence to exclusively work with knowledge that I was given about transoric forms, the penta and the wa, that given the kind of being that I am with my unconscious mind, it's only truly when I am in a situation where I have to talk about it, whatever it is, that the actual knowledge base that's inside of me comes out. And as I began to work with him to develop the infrastructure of what would become human consulting, I had to penetrate with my consciousness the nature of the wa, the nature of an organism that's made up of 16 parts. And in looking at the nature of that organism and the way in which that organism was structured, I began to see something that opened up a possibility for me about where the knowledge that I was given could actually lead to. I began to see that there is a very specific way in which essential ingredients are brought together, and that there is a sequence to the way in which they are brought together. And as I began to work with the wa, because gates are related to codons and so forth and so on, I was able to begin to see about how you create a genetically fixed and secure cell. Everything about what I do at the human consulting level is about engineering correct cells. And through that insight into the potential of how the 16 are held together, I began to see an opening. And the opening that I began to see is that human design has an obvious relationship to genetics. It's an obvious relationship to genetics. It is the one thing that statistical analysis has been able to substantiate scientifically. That is, that we're able to correlate what we see as individual type as specific genetic differences. However, the real essence of the knowledge of human design is that we have been given a way to recognize the imprint. So when we're looking at somebody's basic body graph, what we're looking at is their differentiation. In other words, we're not looking at their commonality. We're not looking at what holds the whole picture together. We're actually looking at what's different. Now, geneticists can tell you precisely why we're alike, but can't tell you why we're different. They have a hard time telling the difference between us and a fruit fly. Well, it's true. I mean, you know, genetically we're basically the same. There are differences, obviously, but still. And by the time you get to primates, it's like, woof. You know, the gift that we have is that we're able to see differentiation, not commonality. When I had my experience, you all know, because I make a story out of it, I was a nihilist, I was an atheist, I didn't see things in this way. The idea of reincarnation to me seemed like such a seduction, such a trap. I couldn't imagine it, truly couldn't imagine it. And then I go through this kind of experience, and I come to the other side, and one of the things that I am given in my experience is global orchestration directories, and I call the global incarnation index, all of this kind of cache of record stuff. All of this, that's why it's called Jovian Archive. The archive is stored in the four moons, in the electromagnetic field of the Galilean moons. It's a little gray mysticism. That archive, it was based on something. Everything from the moment that I was given this knowledge, I was given something that it was clear to me that my path in this process was to be as objective and scientific as I possibly could to get to a point where I could substantiate revelation as fact. And at the very, very basis of this whole knowledge, on one side is, are we truly programmed? We have a scientific answer. Neutrinos with mass. Are we truly differentiated and unique? Yes, we have a scientific basis. But do we really come back? Do we really come back? And if we really come back, how do we come back? And how do we know where to go when we come back? And what do we come back as? And why are we coming back? And if we're coming back, what's the track? How many times do we come back? And where are we when we come back? And what are we when we come back? And on and on and on and on. The mystic in me looks at all of that and says, if you get the answer here, you have one of those great, great answers. This is really the core. Because in order to get to this answer, it was obvious to me that I would have to find some kind of a way to do precisely what the geneticists are doing and what they've accomplished. In other words, to be able to see the sequence. We can see the differentiation, can't see the sequence. They can see the sequence, they can't see the differentiation. We need to find a bridge. And it's so clear to me that we need to find a bridge because only the bridge legitimizes what we can find. I truly made a mistake in the way in which I initiated this program and the way in which I conducted it. I have a third line mind. You make mistakes. I have never ever before taught a course where I didn't know where I was going. And when I started this in October, I had no idea, absolutely no idea where I was going. And I didn't do it right. First of all, I manipulated the data in order to try to make it easier to teach it. In other words, I turned the formulas around to try to start from the now backwards instead of from the past forward. I messed up some of the calculations. Nobody noticed, except for a few people, Andrea being one. And you see, this is what frightens me. What frightens me is that I lay out a sequence and everybody goes, uh-huh. But you see, the whole thing about this knowledge is that if this knowledge is not verifiable, I do not want knowledge to go out into the world. I don't. I have to be responsible for the integrity of this knowledge. When I started, I thought, okay, if I open up this door, given the way my mind works, I will find my way. Yeah, but this is much more complex than what one mind can do. I realized from the beginning that this had to be some kind of quasi-research program. to get people involved. But when I realized after I reviewed what I had taught about a month after the course was over, and I started to go through the data myself, I realized that, well, I had introduced correct principles, but I had put everybody on the wrong track. And so I want to readjust all of that and set this up properly so that the real goals of this program can be achieved. I like to be contrite. When you have a big ego like mine, and you say, I fucked up, and it's wonderful. I have too much respect for this knowledge. Yesterday, those of you that were in the cross course, I talked about how leadership works with making things obscure and distracting you. It would have been so easy to do that kind of a number. And I can't do that. I've been having continual communications with Andrea, whose interest is in genetics, as you know. And I have asked her to lead a research team. And a research team that's going to be guided by the materials that I'm going to introduce over the next 2 days. A research team whose role is to do the research, so that we can get to a place where we have an ability to be able to see verifiably exactly what we're working with before we try to draw any conclusions. That we conduct this in as scientific a manner as we possibly can. Now, I've changed the program in the sense that, first of all, I have established with Gennaro at Human Design Online 2 dates where I will be able to bring all of you together online to discuss the process and the progress that we make in this program of getting to a point where we can hopefully be able to prove genetic sequencing from our side, and ultimately out of that to be able to substantiate incarnation as a legitimate scientific fact. I'm no longer going to charge you anything. So I guess that in itself is a relief, but I will no longer charge you anything. What I will arrange is that aside from the 2 times that we will meet online to discuss the research that we're working on and to be able to move forward, I will also arrange for us next year in April to gather together so that we can be back together physically and we can put together everything that we have done up to that point, and let's see where we get to at that point. There isn't anything for me that is more important than the pursuit of this knowledge, specifically. It's essential to human design. It's essential to the longevity of this knowledge. It's like everything else. It's like I wait for somebody to discover the magnetic monopole. All of this is part of getting to a point where beyond what we do in the commercialization of this knowledge to the uninitiated, that it becomes a standard based on its legitimacy. So everything for me about going through this sequencing now is that what I want to do is take the foundation that I gave you, aside from the calculations, because it's only the calculations that were incorrect. I want to start from the foundation I gave you, and I want to start from another perspective. My joke about myself in this particular situation is, I suppose, it's really the ultimate vanity. I thought I was smarter than the voice. What to do? I'm not that smart. I really not. Where all this comes from is that the voice gave me the primary sequencing points. That's really where all of this started for me in terms of understanding the nature of being. When I was told the story, I was told about how the crystals that were going to be the crystals of consciousness for this planet, how they moved in a vast bundle that had tentacles like an octopus with these 4 tentacles. And there were primary initiating points that were translated for me in the language of the wheel into the primary initiating points in the wheel. Just to make sure that we're all in line together on this. We're going to be looking at the roots of these 4 sequences, the 4 suits that we have, the alpha, the weaver, the corner, and the bundle. In other words, we're going to be looking at their source, and we're going to be looking at their source position. It is interesting that everything is moving further and further away from each other in the expansion of the cosmos. And that it's clear for me that we are actually in the beginnings of a point of contraction. And one of the things about the expansion is that all 4 of these points began as one point. I mean, it's one of the basic things to recognize. And these 4 points have been moving further and further away from each other, and it's the very tension of these 4 points moving from each other that holds the tension of the totality together. And what we look at as suits, that is what we look at as these streams, I want you to see their mystical sourcing. In other words, to be able to see that, it's like thinking about 4 great races, if you will, flowing into a common field. Out of these 4 strands comes everything. This is theory. Do not believe. It goes back to my very first days in human design. This is not about believing. This is about taking down the information as theoretical possibility. Let's see if it's true. Because not only am I pointing you towards a genetic sequence and incarnation, but we're also looking at a unified field theory. It's very spooky where we are. This is the far, 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 far edge of this knowledge. It's way past bases. It's out of the loop. Because what we're really looking at is the way in which the life force works. This is like analyzing God. I want you to see that in some kind of perspective. I want you to recognize that this is really a frontier place. Nobody's been here before. Nobody. And we don't know what we're doing. No idea. And this is the thing. This is the magic of what it is to be at the edge of something. And this is the genius that we have. The genius that we have is that we're here to take the clues and bite and see where we go. So when you're looking at these originating suits, I want you to see that. I want you to see this fundamental relationship to the way the universe started just in its physics. Quarks and leptons, the subdivision and the subdivision, the 2, the 4, the 8, the 16, boom, out you go. So this is also not just simply sequence we're looking at, but sequence that has a root. When I did the bases last year at this event, I was hoping that at some level, the highest level of taking in that knowledge is simply a recognition that each and every one of us in our diversity, that we embody a unique perspective that is also a building block of the illusion. In other words, each of us carry components that when linked to others result in the illusion. It's like somebody bringing the 4 parts of an object, and once all the 4 parts are together, the object has a life of its own. And each and every one of us in the bases that we carry, that is, we carry instruments. You know how, if you look at science fiction, you see these holographic scenes where it appears that somebody is standing there and it's all made by light. And each of us is one of those lights. Not just one, We have many, many bases in our design. Many, many bases, aside from the primary bases of our profiles, all the bases that are associated with all the activations in our design. And every single one of them is part of, in the combination of things, generating the illusion of what life is. So when you're looking here at these four streams, you also have to see that these four streams, not only are they unique in that sense in their origin, but that their origin is a unique orientation. You know, the overall heading for the bases is orientation. They're the orienters. The bases are what give us the specific perspective. And so that you can see that not only is a sequence unique, but it has a unique perspective. Now, I'm convinced, theoretically, I think, therefore I'm not sure, that these four become two. I mean, in order for us to actually get to the life sequence. And that when these four become two, there's something that holds them together, and it's the glue. And the glue is the subjective. In other words, the fifth base that, as we know, takes on all the sequences in its incarnative process. Or at least theoretically it does. So very important to see that I like to be able to move in my consciousness very quickly in terms of scale. You know, because the moving from the microcosm to the macrocosm and back. Because constantly when you're doing that, you begin to see things, you know, relatively. You see them differently. If I think that this is a sequence that goes back and it's rooted in a specific base as its root, as its perspective, I also see that the chain of life that moves through that, the incarnative process that moves through that this is the way in which that particular theme comes alive through all incarnations and is one of those components that allows life to be what it is at any given time. And to see the sequences, the four different sequences, they supposedly have different return cycles. So if you've got a sequence that's, you know, changing all the time, you're incarnating all the time, and you got another one that only changes once in a while, you know, there is something we have to discover. What is the relationship between those? And if we do, we know something that science does not. See, we have this wonderful advantage of being able to anthropomorphize anything. Anything. Because we have all these keyword components that we can look at and we can give names to. When I look at these two streams, what I see is that there are two dualities, two binaries that make a great duality. There are these two binaries, incarnative processes. And that these incarnative processes have a natural linking to each other. And then I look at, well, what does that mean in the world? You know, who's on which team? Who's doing what? And then when you see who's on which team, what kind of design do they have? One of the things that I discovered by not trying to be smarter than the voice was to go from where the voice led me. And I saw immediately that there are sequences, line sequences, that are the themes of any genetic sequence. So, we're going to look at the Weaver tomorrow, because today I want to do all kinds of introductory stuff. I'm just leading you ahead in the illustration here. Now, according to what I was able to calculate, and we'll go through that tomorrow, what I was able to calculate was that based on this sequence, that the movement is always third line, sixth line, fourth line, third line, sixth line, fourth line. In other words, there is a line sequence that operates through these. And what I discovered, or at least it seems that I discovered, because we'll have to verify that, is that not only are these streams sourced differently, not only do they have a unique base perspective to them, but they also have a specific mathematical progression that's different from the others. Now at the same time, you'll see that in the other sequences, there are line repetitions. In other words, there can be a first line in another sequence. Is that the bridge? In other words, what we're going to be looking at is by being able to lay out the actual physical sequence and to know the movement from hexagram to hexagram, from line to line, we're actually going to be able to see the pattern, what the line pattern is. We're going to see the line patterns of the other sequences, and we're going to have an opportunity to see how they fit together. Because how they fit together is going to be the key to the whole sequencing process. We have to find a way. We have to find a way to bring the 4 to 2. And ultimately in that, the 2 becomes 1. In order to defend my poor ego, I would like to remind you that in the world of genetic research, there are hundreds of thousands of scientists employed. And here we are, the team on the other side. And if you've ever seen a David and Goliath movie, this is one of them. So it's good to keep that in perspective so you can appreciate what kind of a challenge this is, to be able to find a mathematical substantiation for this theory. It's quite a trick. Okay, so we have our 4 sequences. And we can see that these sequences, they are bringing something specific that's part of a general combination. Which means that if you're part of the reactive suit, in other words, if you're incarnating on this sequence, what that does mean is something that esoteric people have talked about for a long time, that I never gave much credence to, which is that each and every incarnation may in fact be a development. In other words, rather than the assumption that we start off from scratch each time, despite incarnating, that there is an inherent development process or a growth process in our consciousness as we move along. Because one of the things to see is that if you are limited to a specific sequence, there's no question then that there is a process that's involved. And the moment we're going to be able to write out that sequence, we're going to see very clearly what the progression is. Something else. By being able to see what the sequence is, and being able to see what the progression is, we can then go back and we can learn all kinds of things about each and every one of those hexagrams in those sequences. Because we understand its overall purpose. We're trying to not simply write the human genetic code. I already have a map variation of that. It's not so much we're doing that. What we're actually looking at is trying to figure out how life itself is sequenced. All life. All life. It is the universal sequencing program. Okay, so let's get into numbers here. It is clear that we have a variation in the number of times that incarnation takes place on these sequences. Now, what that also means is that these sequences are, for example, for the purposes of incarnation, we would map a sequence according to a round, as an example. If you're going to map the sequence according to the round, then you're going to have 19,000 years in which you can have, on an integrative sequence, 288 incarnations, as an example. Now, obviously, that's going to be spread out over that entire period of time. So we're also looking at something interesting here in terms of spacing. my perspective, there has to be a way in which the 4s become 2s. In other words, for me, there must be a way in which the sequences hook up. Now, I already have my own theories about this based on what I understand from base knowledge, the way bases relate to each other. However, I am uncertain whether or not that applies here, and I'm going to leave it out and see what happens when we simply just go in and we look at these sequences and we mark the sequences first. I mean, I take that from the scientists. That's what they did first. They started to place their markers in order to lay out the genetic code. We're really going to have to mark it out. We're going to have to mark out clearly each of the sequences, and not the way an ego manifester does it, who's a very busy man. Again, that was one of the difficulties. I am uncertain as to whether my hand calculations with my calculator and my eyes, did a good job in running out those sequences. I honestly don't know. I don't want to be responsible in that sense for claiming that they're accurate. Everything we're going to do now is going to be tested right down the line. And every sequence that we go through, we're going to verify. Once, by the way, we can establish that the sequences operate correctly, then I can look at software application. In other words, developing some little application that'll help us in being able to get to the final point here, which is to be able to give one of you a software upgrade that will allow you to do the sequencing of your clients. I mean, after all, that's the point. The point is to be able to offer sequencing to anyone. That's our mundane level in what this is as a commercial end to what we're doing. It's like, here we're doing basic research, but there is somewhere down the road, this application. It begins with first going through the sequences and making sure that these formulas, not so much that they work, because you'll see that if you start from the past forward, they do, but it's measuring them in terms of the accuracy of what hexagram leads to what hexagram. And as you will see tomorrow, when we come to the codon-related sequence, this is something that is going to be very, very complex to achieve. So, there are real challenges involved in just getting the sequencing out. And one of the first things that we'll have to do is that those of you, I've talked with Andrea about how we set up the research team, and basically, and I think all of you know Andrea, basically the idea would be that each and every one of you who are truly interested in participating in the research, you can still benefit from the research. You participate in the whole program, whether you're directly involved in the research or not. But if you want to be involved in actually participating actively in the research, to let Andrea know. And also let her know where your own interests are in terms of what you think you can bring to this, so that we can begin to do it. For example, these sequences, we need to have at least 3 people trying to do the same sequence, and to be able to then see whether or not it stands up. We need to verify that. Nobody's ever done this. I mean, the one that I just showed you, that's the first time it's ever been done. I mean, I don't know if it's accurate. It needs to be verified. So, that's a classic beginning place to go through that, to go through the easy formulas, the basic formulas, and to make sure, first of all, that those sequences are accurate. Once we have accurate sequences, we can do incredible things. I mean, incredible things. Because then we're really going to understand the chemical movement. And in understanding the chemical movement, we can actually begin to apply it to a map. But first we have to see the movement, and we have to know that the movement is accurate. So you can see here is just broken down. So again, you can see the variation, the variation per cycle, and again, it's just the same kind of thing. Ultimately we're going to be looking at, I'm interested in these numbers, not so much that I want to figure out exactly when somebody comes in and goes out. Because as you'll see, And this is something that I will send out to all of you because I already have it on file. There are those of you that did not attend the death course. And there is all of the death course material available that's online. But for those of you in the class who do not have the appropriate material, I'll give you a download link. And in the death course, you can actually calculate through the information of death. You can actually find out, when where the position is for the next coming in and so forth and so on. I'm not interested in that for this. That is, what this is telling me is the relative weight of each step. I mean, these are sequences after all. So there's a difference in density between a sequence that's going to have 288 variations and one that's going to have 40. And for me, it's just the obvious. And there's many ways of looking at that. Is the 288 more complex? Or is the 40 more complex? In other words, there's a weighting problem here because we're dealing in duality and the this and that. But it's one of the things to keep in mind is that these sequences have a different weight to them. For example, if you come back 288 times, even if you don't remember it, you're experienced. I mean, coming back 40 times over 19,000 years is not like you have a lot of experience. So there is, what does that actually mean and what's the value of that? And then, of course, how we're going to see that is that we're going to be able to take each of these 4 sequencing concepts and we're going to be able to root them. Because what I want to be able to do is that I want to be able to give you a framework to begin, a framework that you have underneath, that you see how different, in essence, these 4 different ways actually are. And remember, the 5 is always hidden. I mean, it's always hidden, but it's there. It's the result of the other 4. It's always the result of the other 4. I don't know how well you can see that. This is the left angle cross of Incarnation. So funny about this cross. My birthday, as you well know, is April the 9th, but my due date was May 7th. Had I been born on my due date, I would have been born on the left angle cross of Incarnation. Jürgen Salpa, who I worked with for many years, was instrumental in helping me launch design. His birthday was May 7th. Okay. And my first wife, her birthday was May 7th. Very odd. Left angle cross of Incarnation. Left angle cross of Incarnation. This is where I was pointed to by the voice. And that you can see that this left angle is the jump. It's the 6-3. In other words, this is, again, having just gone through the quarters as we've done, understanding what it is to be a 6-3. In other words, understanding that this is nothing more than transition, nothing more than movement. This is the continuity, this is the movement, the deep, deep mutative movement from one thing to the next, coming in, going out, coming in, going out, the ladder on their body, going up, going down, coming in, going out. It's the whole movie. And this is the archetype here in this left angle cross of Incarnation. And you can see here that it is a 6-3 and it works this way. The corner is the personality sun, the 24-6. When you're looking at 24, we have just been through civilization. This is a deep, deep, deep form principle. It's form principle. And you can see that as we move through these 4 primary points, we're also talking about the 4 quarters. And that the origin of the quarters are these sequences. You know, it's all connected. I mean, it's all connected. See, for me, it's not a wheel. That's the illusion. You know, for me, it's simply four things. And the illusion is they make a wheel. I mean, it's just an illusion. We mark places on the wheel, we do all of these things. But it's just these four things that create a fifth thing. And the fifth thing we call wheel, we call human, we call the world, we call this, we call that. And that those four quarters, you know, and yeah, it's nice to see them in a wheel, but they're not. And yet we know something. Every right angle cross teaches us that lesson. You know, and every left angle, with the exception of the very, very end where we saw the friction lines where the quarters meet, they all let us know that, yes, these are four very distinct things, but hey, there are ways in which you connect to the others. I mean, there are ways. So we look at the cross and we say, yes, here's where the sun is, but look, these are the other three arms. They're in this quarter, and that quarter, and that quarter. And that's how you know that in the whole sequencing, there are these bridges. They're there. And of course, one of the things for us to see is, how do they connect? How do they bridge each other? All we're talking about is, how do they sequence? Because what we're going to see in the sequence is that even though it's sourced from here, when you start going through the chain, you're going to see that the hexagrams come from any quarter. They're going to have to. It all has to be glued together. And how does it get glued together? And I can't even imagine how it gets glued together until we have measured sequences. You know, my brain goes nuts. You know, because every time I try to move my imagination towards, you know, what happens, how do they meet, where do they meet? Ooh, I don't know. I don't really know what the sequence is. See, I want to be able to see, how does it work? How does the illusion work? How does the five, because it's the five after all, we know the five's going to experience all the incarnative processes of the other four. That the five is the thing that magically somehow is the byproduct and the glue of the whole experience. I want to know how it emerges. You know, because the moment that you understand how the illusion emerges, you understand everything. I mean, everything. You know, when the voice gave me the Aleph, it wasn't like I was going to say, okay, I'm going to stop at this point. I'll stop when I'm dead, or when I get to the end of it. If I ever get to the ring past Nod, I'll stop. But it's so obvious to me that there's a place to go here. You know, that we do have the ability to be able to work it out so that we end up with a true unified field understanding of the whole life-generating process. Sounds wonderful. Okay, I want to take a look at each of these, and we're going to begin with the corner. Okay, when you're looking at the corner, these symbols. I'm not talking about the shapes. You know, we have the triangle, the circle, the square, and the straight line. I'm talking about the symbols on the inside. These symbols, one day I do a course just on these symbols. You know, they are universal formulas. I mean, they are universal formulas. They can be used mathematically. They can be used as language. I'm the only being that actually understands them. But they are incredible things. And again, this is part of how, you know, these are the essential syllables that form the word. And the essential syllables together, through the breath, The illusion, become the word, become the world, become existence, become all of these things. Everything can be reduced to these formulas. That is clear to me. Everything. My whole thing is, okay, that's great to know as a mystic. Can I know that as science? Can I prove it? Can I prove it? That's the most fun. I'm a third line mind. I'm at my very core, I'm a scientist. I'm not afraid of failure, because I know in failure you find things. It's all about discovery. This is the process. And this is as scientific as I've ever been able to get in human design. The rest of it has just been, the unconscious genius of my mind letting out its 4323 structure. But this transcends my capacities. That's what makes it science. There is nothing else one can call it. Because in order for all of us to be able to get to a common point, we have to have verifiable steps, otherwise we're not going to get there. And it means that we really have to be in the heart of this as an experimental process. So we have the corner, and we're going to see that the corner, this is the key, and it's the 24th gate, and it's the 6th line. See, I look at them. I tried to find in me all kinds of correlations. This line, the gift horse. Life is the ultimate opportunity. It's one of the things to understand about what life is. It's an opportunity. It's an opportunity for consciousness. And it's an opportunity for consciousness if form is deeply mutated. The opportunity of being in form begins with the corner. It's just the opportunity. It is the gift horse, The gift horse comes from Trojan myth, the Trojan War. And in order to fool the Trojans, the Greeks built a horse and put it up on the beach as an offering to the Trojan warriors. And of course they placed a small brigade of men inside of the horse. And the Trojans, being overwhelmed with their sense of victory, dragged this giant horse into the walls of Troy. And of course in the evening the Greeks sneaked out and were able to defeat the Trojans. What an interesting myth. This is the source. This is the very beginning. This is the consciousness that resides within. This is all about the sequence that actually creates the form that can house the consciousness. It doesn't always come out. It doesn't always gain victory. Not always. And we see that is the law of form and consciousness as a relationship. The victories are relative. The level of consciousness of the leaf of a tree is very different from you and me. This is the whole long chain and sequence of trying to find forms that will give the greatest benefit to the potential of consciousness. My joke for years that nobody could get, which was the only difference between a man and a dog is a man's not a dog. And nobody still laughs at that joke. We both have personality crystals that are exactly the same in their potential. And we both have design crystals that create very different forms. I've got a neocortex and no tail. My dog has a limitation. But this is this sequence, the way in which this sequence evolves. Everything about this sequence is the evolution of the conceptual vehicle. It's 24th gate. It is that unique mutative gate of mind. And after all, when